The mirror lights clicked on one by one, casting their familiar warm glow across the cramped trailer. Tommy Martinez had been doing makeup for 37 years, painting faces that would be seen by millions. He'd covered scars, erased wrinkles, and transformed ordinary people into extraordinary characters. But as he looked at the man sitting quietly in his chair, Tommy realized this face was different. This face had something that couldn't be painted on and shouldn't be painted over. This was Morgan Freeman, and what Tommy discovered that night would change everything he thought he knew about beauty, dignity, and the stories written in human skin. If you enjoy calm, story-driven documentaries like this, subscribe for the next chapter of Morgan Freeman's Untold legacy. The production schedule said 45 minutes, standard time for character makeup, enough to transform anyone into whatever the director envisioned. Tommy laid out his brushes with practiced precision, foundation bottles in gradation from light to dark, concealer sticks arranged by coverage strength. This was his laboratory where reality met fantasy. Morgan settled into the chair with unhurried grace that filled the small space. No nervous energy, no fidgeting, no demands for coffee or conversation. He simply sat, hands resting comfortably on the chair arms, eyes meeting Tommy's in the mirror with directness that was both welcoming and somehow ancient. Most actors brought chaos into the trailer. Morgan brought stillness, and in that stillness, Tommy began to notice things he usually overlooked. The face looking back from the mirror was a map of experiences. Deep lines carved by decades of laughter ran from the corners of Morgan's eyes, creating pathways that seemed to lead directly to his soul. His forehead bore horizontal creases that spoke of concentration, of countless moments of curiosity and surprise. There were lines around his mouth from smiling, from speaking, from millions of words delivered in that voice, synonymous with wisdom and authority. Most makeup artists would see these as problems to solve, imperfections to minimize, signs of aging to disguise. But something made Tommy pause with his foundation brush halfway to Morgan's face. "You know," Morgan said quietly, his voice carrying that familiar measured cadence even in casual conversation. "I've been sitting in chairs like this for more years than I care to count. And I've learned that the most interesting conversations happen right here in front of these mirrors when it's just two people and honest light." Tommy nodded, still holding the brush. He'd heard similar sentiments before, usually from actors trying to connect, trying to make the mundane process of makeup application feel meaningful. But there was something different in Morgan's tone, something that suggested this wasn't small talk, but invitation. An invitation to see beyond the surface, beyond the job, beyond the routine that had become second nature. What Tommy did next went against his usual routine he'd learned in 4 decades of professional makeup artistry. Instead of beginning with foundation, instead of following the standard protocol that had worked for thousands of faces before this one, Tommy set down his brush and really looked. He looked at the man in the chair, not as a canvas to be painted, but as a story already perfectly told. And for the first time in his career, Tommy wondered if his job was to enhance what was already there rather than cover it up. The production notes called for age reduction, authority enhancement, camera-ready finish, standard requirements for any leading man over 50 in Hollywood. The director wanted Morgan to look timeless but not old, wise but not weathered, authoritative but approachable. Tommy had fulfilled similar requests hundreds of times, using every trick in his considerable arsenal to subtract years and add polish. He knew exactly how to minimize those laugh lines, how to fill in the deeper creases, how to create the illusion of perfection that cameras loved and audiences expected. But as he studied Morgan's reflection, Tommy began to understand that those lines weren't imperfections at all. They were credentials. Each wrinkle was evidence of a life fully lived, each crease a testament to expressions genuinely felt. The lines around Morgan's eyes crinkled when he smiled, not from weakness in the skin, but from strength in the spirit that had spent decades finding reasons to be genuinely joyful. The deeper lines across his forehead weren't signs of aging, but proof of a mind that had engaged seriously with the world, that had wrinkled in concentration while learning, growing, becoming the person who now sat with such comfortable authority in Tommy's chair. Tommy had painted youth onto aged faces so many times he could do it blindfolded. He'd erased evidence of laughter, worry, contemplation, and experience, creating smooth masks that photographed beautifully but somehow felt hollow. He'd made 70-year-olds look 45 and 60-year-olds look 30, all in service of an industry that worshipped artificial perfection over authentic presence. But something about Morgan's face made Tommy question the entire enterprise. "Tell me," Morgan said, as if reading Tommy's thoughts, "what do you see when you look at this face?" The question was more profound than it seemed. In all his years of makeup artistry, no one had ever asked him this. Directors told him what they wanted to see. Actors told him what they hoped to hide. But no one had ever asked what he actually saw. What Tommy saw in that moment was the difference between a face that had been lived in and a face that had been preserved. And for the first time, he understood why some actors commanded respect the moment they walked into a room, while others, despite perfect features and flawless skin, somehow seemed to disappear. Tommy had worked with beautiful people, faces that were symmetrical masterpieces, needing barely any enhancement to look perfect under lights. But he'd noticed that these perfect faces often struggled to convey genuine emotion, as if their lack of character lines left them without the vocabulary of expression that comes from a life fully experienced. They could look stunning, but they couldn't look wise. They could appear youthful, but they couldn't project authority. Morgan's face was different. Every line told a story, and together, those stories created a presence that couldn't be manufactured, only earned. The slight asymmetry around his eyes spoke of countless real smiles. The deeper creases in his brow evidenced decades of serious thought. Even the way he held his mouth at rest suggested someone who had learned the power of measured words. "I see a face that doesn't need fixing," Tommy said quietly, surprising himself with his honesty. "I see a face that would be diminished by anything I might do to it." Morgan nodded slowly, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, deepening those laugh lines that Tommy was supposed to minimize. And yet, here we are in a makeup trailer, with a schedule to keep, and a director waiting for his vision to materialize. It was true. The production machine ground forward regardless of personal revelations or artistic epiphanies. There were cameras to satisfy, lights to complement, and an audience that had been trained to expect a certain level of visual polish. Tommy couldn't simply abandon his profession because of a moment of philosophical clarity, but he could choose how to practice it. What Tommy decided to do next, he'd never done it this way before in his 4 decades of professional makeup artistry. Instead of covering Morgan's character lines, he would enhance them. Instead of creating the illusion of youth, he would celebrate the beauty of experience. Tommy selected his finest brushes, not for foundation, but for subtle highlighting. He chose colors not to mask, but to bring out the natural depth already present in Morgan's skin. Where most makeup artists would fill in the lines around his eyes, Tommy used the faintest touch of shadow to give them more definition. Where the standard approach would smooth away evidence of countless genuine smiles, Tommy applied the barest hint of highlight to make those laugh lines catch the light more beautifully. It was delicate work, requiring a completely different skill set than the coverage-based techniques Tommy had mastered. This was enhancement artistry, celebration makeup, the difference between painting over a beautiful piece of aged wood and simply applying a coat of oil to bring out the natural grain. Every brushstroke had to honor what was already there while making it more visible, more striking, more true to itself. Morgan watched the process in the mirror with evident interest, occasionally nodding as he saw Tommy make choices that preserved rather than erased. There was something deeply satisfying about working with someone who understood the value of authenticity, who didn't flinch when Tommy enhanced a line rather than concealed it. Most actors would have stopped the process immediately, demanding conventional coverage that would make them appear younger, smoother, more traditionally camera-ready. "You know," Morgan said as Tommy worked around his eyes with practiced precision, "I've spent a lot of years learning that the most powerful thing you can bring to any role is truth. Not the truth you think people want to see, but the truth of who you actually are, including all the evidence of how you got that way." Tommy paused in his work, understanding immediately what Morgan meant. He'd seen actors try to play characters younger than themselves, struggling against their own faces, fighting the evidence of their experience instead of using it. He'd watched performers attempt to portray wisdom while hiding every sign that they'd lived long enough to acquire any. The results were always unconvincing, no matter how skillful the makeup or how expensive the effects. What Morgan was describing was the difference between acting and being, and Tommy realized he'd been complicit in the illusion that they were the same thing. His job, as he'd always understood it, was to help actors become someone else. But perhaps his real job was to help them become more themselves. The entertainment industry had trained audiences to associate smooth skin with trustworthiness, symmetrical features with heroism, and youth with virtue. But real life told a different story. The people who commanded genuine respect and authority were rarely the ones with perfect faces. They were the ones whose faces reflected their character, whose expressions had been shaped by years of making difficult decisions, facing challenging circumstances, and emerging with their integrity intact. Tommy thought about the great character actors he'd worked with over the years, the ones who could convey more with a single glance than beautiful young stars could manage in an entire scene. Their power came not from physical perfection, but from the visible evidence of experience, from faces that had been lived in and marked by the living. They didn't need to convince audiences they were wise or strong or capable. Their faces provided all the evidence anyone needed. "The interesting thing about faces," Morgan continued, as Tommy worked to enhance the natural dignity already present in his features, "is that they're autobiographies written in flesh. Every line is a chapter, every mark a significant event. When you try to erase that history, you're essentially asking someone to forget everything that made them who they are." It was a profound observation, and one that made Tommy reconsider every face he'd ever painted. How many stories had he erased in service of conventional beauty standards? How many hard-won character marks had he covered with foundation and concealer? How many unique faces had he transformed into variations of the same artificial ideal? The work was nearly finished now, and the face looking back from the mirror was recognizably Morgan Freeman, but somehow more so. Every distinctive feature had been honored and enhanced. His natural gravitas appeared more pronounced, his inherent wisdom more visible, his authentic presence more commanding. He looked like himself, only more clearly defined, as if someone had adjusted the focus on a photograph that was already compelling. What Tommy had achieved was something that shouldn't have been possible. He'd made Morgan Freeman look more like Morgan Freeman. Not younger, not smoother, not more conventional, but more authentically himself. It was the opposite of traditional makeup artistry, yet somehow more artistic than anything Tommy had accomplished using standard techniques. The transformation was subtle, but profound. Under the warm trailer lights, Morgan's face seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with applied products and everything to do with character made visible. His eyes appeared more knowing, his expression more peaceful, his entire presence more magnetic. Tommy had somehow managed to make experience look like the luxury it actually was. "That's remarkable," Morgan said, studying his reflection with evident appreciation. "I look like myself, but somehow more so. Like you've made visible things that were always there, but perhaps not quite clear enough to see." Tommy nodded, still marveling at what he'd accomplished. It hadn't been about adding anything that wasn't already present. It had been about recognizing what was there and giving it the respect it deserved. The lines around Morgan's eyes weren't flaws to be hidden, but evidence of a life spent in genuine engagement with the world. The deeper creases in his forehead weren't signs of aging, but proof of serious thought and consideration. The subtle asymmetries that made his face unique weren't imperfections, but distinguishing characteristics that separated him from every other face in the world. There was a knock on the trailer door, followed by an assistant's voice calling that they were ready for Morgan on set. The artificial urgency of production schedules intruded on the quiet revelation that had been unfolding in the small, well-lit space. But something had been established in those 45 minutes that couldn't be undone by external pressures or professional demands. Morgan stood slowly, adjusting his wardrobe with the same unhurried grace he'd brought to sitting. He looked at Tommy in the mirror one final time, and something passed between them that was part gratitude, part recognition, part shared understanding of what had just occurred. What happened next was a moment so simple it might have been overlooked by anyone not paying attention, but it carried enough weight to change how Tommy thought about his profession for the rest of his career. Morgan extended his hand for a shake, a formal gesture of thanks that was standard between actor and makeup artist. But instead of the quick professional handshake Tommy expected, Morgan held his hand for a moment longer, making eye contact that conveyed something deeper than conventional courtesy. "Thank you," Morgan said. And in those two words, Tommy heard recognition, not just for the makeup work, but for the choice to see him clearly, to honor what was there rather than trying to change it. What you did here today wasn't just makeup. It was something closer to portrait artistry. Tommy felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the trailer's heating system and everything to do with being genuinely seen by someone he respected. In 4 decades of professional work, he'd received countless compliments on his technical skill, his speed, his ability to transform faces according to directorial vision, but no one had ever thanked him for seeing them. Morgan moved toward the trailer door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "You know, there's something powerful about meeting someone who sees your face as a story worth honoring, rather than a problem to solve. I won't forget that." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Tommy alone with his brushes, his mirrors, and a completely new understanding of what his job could be. The familiar tools looked the same, but everything else had changed. The foundation bottles that had once been instruments of transformation now seemed like instruments of erasure. The concealer sticks that had once been tools of perfection now looked like tools of denial. What Tommy did in the minutes after Morgan left would become a ritual he'd perform after every subsequent makeup session, a way of remembering the lesson he'd learned that night about the difference between covering up and revealing truth. Tommy began cleaning his brushes, but slowly, thoughtfully, giving himself time to process what had occurred. Each brush held evidence of the work they'd done together, pigments and powders that had been used not to hide, but to highlight, not to disguise, but to clarify. As he cleaned each tool, Tommy thought about all the faces he'd painted over the years and wondered how many stories he'd inadvertently erased. The entertainment industry had convinced everyone, including Tommy, that faces were raw material to be shaped according to current beauty standards. Wrinkles were problems, lines were flaws, and any sign of age or experience was an obstacle to overcome. The goal was always to make faces younger, smoother, more symmetrical, more conventionally attractive. But Morgan had shown him that faces weren't problems to be solved. They were stories to be honored. Tommy thought about his own face, reflected dimly in the now darkened mirror. At 62, He'd spent decades hiding from cameras, always working behind the scenes, always ensuring that other people's faces looked perfect, while never considering whether his own face might have stories worth telling. He'd internalized the same standards he'd been applying to others, seeing his own lines and marks as evidence of decline rather than evidence of experience. But if Morgan's face was a masterpiece of lived experience, what did that make Tommy's? His hands, scarred from years of precise work, told the story of dedication to craft. His eyes, surrounded by the same kind of laugh lines he'd been trained to minimize, showed evidence of finding joy in his work. His face, weathered by decades of early morning call times and late-night touch-ups, proved he'd been present for every step of his journey. What Tommy understood in that quiet moment, surrounded by the tools of his trade, and the lingering sense of having witnessed something important, was that every face tells a story, and every story deserves to be told truthfully. He thought about all the actors he'd work with in the future, and how he might help them see their faces as Morgan had taught him to see. Not as canvases requiring improvement, but as completed masterpieces requiring only the right lighting to be properly appreciated. Not as problems to be solved, but as stories to be celebrated. Tommy turned off the mirror lights one by one, but the warm glow that had filled the trailer during Morgan's session seemed to linger. The small space felt different now, sacred in a way it hadn't before. It was still a makeup trailer, still a functional workspace where artificial transformations occurred on a daily basis. But it was also now a place where Tommy had learned to see faces as they truly were. Autobiographies written in flesh, histories carved by experience, stories that deserved to be read rather than edited. As he gathered his things and prepared to leave, Tommy caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the darkened mirror. For the first time in years, he didn't look away from the lines around his eyes or the marks left by 6 decades of living. Instead, he saw them as Morgan might, evidence of a life fully engaged, a career spent in service to others, a face that had earned every line it carried. The trailer door closed behind him, but the lesson remained. Some faces carry their own lighting, their own authority, their own undeniable truth. And the highest form of artistry isn't changing those faces, it's helping them shine more clearly as themselves. In the years that followed, Tommy would think often about that night, and the man who taught him to see faces as stories rather than problems. He would approach each actor with the same question Morgan had asked: "What do you see when you look at this face?" And in asking that question, in really looking rather than simply applying standard techniques, Tommy would discover that every face has its own form of beauty, its own unique story, its own irreplaceable truth. The lines, the marks, the evidence of experience weren't obstacles to beauty. They were beauty itself, in its most authentic and powerful form. Morgan Freeman's face told a story his makeup artist couldn't erase, and in learning to read that story, rather than trying to edit it, Tommy discovered the truth behind not just this icon, but every face he would ever have the privilege to see clearly.